Everybody, and welcome. My name is Lori Hurwitz. I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Harper Lecture. I hope you are enjoying your chance to connect or reconnect with each other and the university. I am here today with several members of the Alumni Relations and Development staff, but a few that I wanted to introduce quickly. First, Sharon Marine, who is our new Vice President for Alumni Relations and Development, is here this evening and looks forward to meeting many of you over time. I'm also here with Amy Weber, who is the Alumni Association's liaison to the Alumni Club of Chicago. I also want to take a minute to recognize all the volunteers that are here with us this evening. They work with us to make programs like Harper Lectures possible, and I want you to join me in thanking our regional volunteers who continue to provide opportunities for our alumni in Chicago to connect with the university. Before we get started this evening, I wanted to also provide an update on the university. The last decade has seen significant growth in university faculty and in the scope and quality of many of our academic programs. Some of the exciting growth on campus include the establishment of the Institute for Molecular Engineering, which is producing groundbreaking research at the intersection of science and engineering. The new Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, launched in 2016, is building on the university's greatest strengths in urban scholarship and education. And the Smart Museum of Art is celebrating a recent new gift that will establish the Feitler Center for Academic Inquiry. With all this new progress, the university also continues to ensure our most critical values, ensuring adequate financial resources to enable students from all economic backgrounds to attend and take full advantage of the time of all the university has to offer has been and continues to be a major priority for the university. The Odyssey Scholarship Program is a leader in need-blind, loan-free education for students who would otherwise not be able to afford the cost of one of the world's top universities. To date, Odyssey has opened the door for more than 4,200 promising students. As the university's flagship financial aid program, Odyssey represents UChicago's genuine commitment to social mobility and creating a society where more people have access to an empowering education and a rewarding career. And Odyssey is more than just financial aid. It supports students' full educational experiences, including mentoring, study abroad, and internships, dismantling obstacles to education and careers for talented students with financial need. The willingness of our alumni and friends to give back to the university at all levels is a remarkable tribute to the conviction of our community, and we must protect our unique intellectual culture while providing social mobility and cultural access for all. This is done both through your financial support and your ongoing engagement with the university that continues to build upon our strong network of alumni, parents, and friends. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jasmine Davila from the college's class of 1998 and the Alumni Board of Chicago to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome. I am Jasmine Davila, and I'm a graduate of the college in 1998. I currently serve as the communication chair for the Alumni Club of Chicago. The alumni community of Chicago is by far the largest hub for alumni. Consisting of 106,000 alumni, parents, and friends, the Alumni Club of Chicago is extremely active with multiple events every week. With 25 board members and 10 event volunteers, the Alumni Club of Chicago is a well-developed group of passionate and experienced alumni leaders. It is due to their efforts, in addition to their already heavy day-to-day workloads, that nearly 100 regional club events were organized just last year. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our speaker. Dr. Sarah Ray Stolinga is the Sarah Liston Spurlark Director of the Urban Education Institute at the University of Chicago and a clinical professor in the university's Committee on Education. She also chairs the board of directors of UChicago Impact. In her more than 20 years at UEI, Dr. Stolinga has served in a variety of roles, including intern, researcher, architect, and director. She was appointed the Sarah Liston Spurlark Director in 2015. And as director, she leads all aspects of the Urban Education Institute, overseeing research, operations of schools, and the distribution of models to improve schools nationally. Dr. Stolinga has written extensively on school reform, history, policy, and improvement, including 2 books with Teachers College Press, as well as many articles, blogs, and reports. She's also a faculty member at the university, teaching education and advising undergraduates and graduate students. In the spring of 2015, she received the Llewellyn John and Harriet Manchester Quantrell Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. She received her AB, AM, and PhD degrees in sociology from the University of Chicago. Before we hear from Dr. Stalinka, there will be a short video about the amazing work of the Urban Education Institute. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I would like to take this opportunity to start by thanking the UChicago Alumni Association, as well as Brian Wilson and his team and Alumni Relations and Development for putting on this incredible event. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I would also like to recognize some important leaders from the Urban Education Institute's history that are sitting here in the front row. We have Marv Hoffman, Barbara Williams, and Al Bertani. All three of them were a part of the original work in designing the UChicago Charter School and UChicago UTEP. And Marv and Barbara were actually the original co-directors of the North Kenwood Oakland campus 20 years ago. And so I'd like to recognize that we have some founding leaders here. We also have in the audience one of the co-founders of the UChicago Consortium, Penny Sebring, who's sitting up here in the second row. She continues to work with us and was on the ground when the UChicago Consortium started 28 years ago, so please help me in welcoming Penny. I'd also like to recognize another really important thinker in the development of the Urban Education Institute, and that's Chuck Lewis. He's sitting in the second row here, so please help me to thank Chuck Lewis for his contributions to the Institute. There are also, I see and hear, many Urban Education Institute staff members in the audience. Let me hear you, UEI. This is your work, and I'm honored to represent our collective work on all of our behalf, so thank you for being here. And finally, I would like to recognize my amazing students, both past and present, who took the time to be here this evening. You are the future, you inspire me, and your interest and commitment to this field are a really important part of making sure that the next generation is focused on this important work. So thank you very much to the students. So I'm going to start very briefly to pick up where the video left off, and I'm going to give you just a very quick overview of the Urban Education Institute to ground my remarks of the work that I'm going to be highlighting this evening. So the UChicago Urban Education Institute has 4 units within it. The UChicago Consortium, which conducts rigorous applied research. It's been doing this for 28 years. And really the consortium's work is around identifying what matters most for school improvement and for students' outcomes. I'm going to be highlighting some of the key contributions that the consortium has made, both locally and nationally. There have been many, but I'm going to highlight some really important work that they've done to move the needle both in Chicago and nationally. Our second unit is the UChicago Urban Teacher Education Program, which for the last 15 years has been preparing teachers for Chicago. And I'm going to be highlighting unique parts of the UTEP model that are new in my remarks tonight. Also, the UChicago Charter School, our third unit, 20 years old this year, serving 1,800 students on the south side of Chicago across 4 campuses. And tonight, I'm going to make reference to the elementary model of the UChicago Charter School. And finally, our fourth unit, UChicago Impact, which takes our research-based, practice-proven tools national, which has been in existence for 7 years. Importantly, collectively, the Urban Education Institute bridges research and practice. And this is something that tends to be siloed in the field as a whole. So there's much opportunity and promise in the Urban Education Institute bridging research and practice. So I want to start with UEI's mission, which is about knowledge creation. And in that way, it's very much aligned with the spirit of the University of Chicago, our home. The idea behind this, creating reliably excellent public schooling. When you put that in an urban context, reliably excellent schooling is only possible by challenging educational inequities. We live in an American society where there are haves and have-nots, and to be reliably excellent means challenging these gaps. So I want to rewind a little bit in our history in the city of Chicago, the context in which the Urban Education Institute does our work. This is a city that has faced many gaps, in terms of the public schooling that we have offered as a city. And 30 years ago, Education Secretary William Bennett, the then Secretary of Education, called Chicago's public schools the worst in the nation. This was a very difficult time in Chicago's history. There were financial challenges and structural challenges, and there were all kinds of questions in the air about the future of education for our young people. Importantly, if you fast forward 30 years, you'll see that the headlines look dramatically different. And what's happened is a story of dramatic improvement in Chicago public schools, a story that really a lot of people haven't believed or paid much attention to until recently. And so the question is, if we're thinking about educational inequities and closing gaps, I'm going to reflect upon this transition of Chicago public schools, about gaps that we have worked together to close. And to be clear, the Urban Education Institute is only one small part of a much larger education space in which collaborative work has been going on between Chicago public schools, the nonprofit community, and all kinds of philanthropic organizations and partners that have helped to move the needle. But tonight I'll focus on what are the gaps that we've closed and what are the gaps that remain to be closed. So let's start with a gap I would imagine you've all probably heard of. It's called the achievement gap. The achievement gap is this chronic gap, this persistent gap between achievement of low-income students of color and white students in the United States. What I'm showing you here is just one snapshot of the achievement gap. So this is fourth grade achievement on something called the NAEP test, or the National Assessment of Education Progress. This gap is about 26 points in reading and 20 points in math at the fourth grade level. What's important to remember about the achievement gap, though, is it's not just about standardized tests. There are also achievement gaps in high school graduation systematically between low-income students of color and white students, as well as enrollment in things like honors track coursework, and also the proportion of students who take advanced placement and advanced placement tests. So this is a really important gap that we do need to care about. But I'm going to expand our thinking a little bit about outcome gaps to include something that you saw in the video, which is called the attainment gap. This gap between students' college aspirations and what they actually achieve in terms of college attainment. So if we start with Chicago, let's start with college aspirations in our hometown. What I'm showing you here is that in 2016, 71% of students told us that they aspire to have a bachelor's degree. But when we actually look at the percentage we project to have a bachelor's degree 10 years after they start high school or by the time they're 25, that actual number is 18%. Now, to be clear, Chicago has made remarkable progress to hit this 18% number, but it is also clear that there is still an attainment gap. I also want us to understand that this is not just Chicago. This is a national picture of the attainment gap. The vast majority of students tell us that they would like to have a college degree, and yet less than 1 in 3 will actually have a college degree by the time they're 25. Caring about the attainment gap, the reasons are clear. If we look at long-term outcomes, what we see is that those who go to college have a longer life expectancy, they earn more, 51% more, which across a lifetime is $1 million in earnings on average. And they also are happier, they're more civically engaged, and they're more likely to have children who have higher levels of educational attainment. So this is actually, the attainment gap is very important. There's another dimension, however, that's developed just within the last 10 years that's really important to remember. And this has to do with the shift in the United States from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge-based economy. And this is an illustration of that you see on the slide. So in the past 10 years, of the 12 million jobs that have been added in our economy, 99% of those have gone to workers who have at least some college education. So like the achievement gap, focusing on the attainment gap is a really important goal in urban schooling. So now I want to take a step back, because in order to really focus on closing outcome gaps like the attainment and the achievement gap, at the Urban Education Institute, we have found, and we would argue, that we actually have to close a set of precursor gaps. So gaps that we need to focus on closing in order to be able to close outcome gaps like the achievement and the attainment gap. So I'm going to be talking about each of these, the knowledge gap, the preparation gap, and the belief gap. So starting with the knowledge gap, this is a gap between common beliefs about what matters in terms of education outcomes and what evidence tells us actually matters. I'm going to tell you a story to start talking about the knowledge gap. I gave a lecture a few years ago in a mid-sized city, and I was talking about educational improvement and school reform. At the end of my talk, the first question came from the leader of one of the largest education nonprofit organizations in the city. She raised her hand and she asked me this question: why is it that our school district used to be good and it's not good anymore? Why is it that we used to serve students well and now we don't? I'll tell you that I had to think a long time before I answered that question. And what I said to her was, actually, for the students that you serve now, low-income Latino and African American students, your school district never served those students well. Where did this misperception come from? I suppose this nonprofit leader had in her head a graph that looked something like this. This is the high school graduation rate in that school district from the early to mid-1990s. Looks pretty good, right? The line is going up. When you get to the mid-1990s, this is a high school graduation rate that was among the top in this district's state. And so there was this belief that this was a school district that was doing okay. However, let me put in these other lines for you. What I've done is I've disaggregated this district's high school graduation rate by race. And what you see is that there is a large gap between high school graduation of white students compared to African American and Latino students. And in fact, the students of color lines are flat across the entire trend. So what got interpreted by this school district leader as an improvement or a lack of improvement or a decline was actually the fact that white students left the school district over time, and it made the trend lower because of the stagnant performance of the Latino and African American students. So how do we close these knowledge gaps? I'm going to start out by talking about two examples from the consortium that are really important examples of closing the knowledge gap. And the first one is something called Freshmen on Track. The consortium identified 10 years ago that 9th grade course completion was the strongest predictor of high school graduation. In fact, 9th grade grades and getting course credits in the 9th grade year were stronger predictors of high school graduation than race, gender, poverty, or prior achievement combined. These results were counterintuitive, and they challenged assumptions that stakeholders, practitioners, researchers, and the education field as a whole had held as truths about what matters most. There were assumptions in the field that high school was just too late for some students. There were assumptions that test scores or race were the most important factors in high school graduation. It took years and relentless effort and a strong partnership between the consortium, Chicago Public Schools, the nonprofit community, and the philanthropic community before there was widespread belief that this relationship and the importance of freshman year, Freshmen on Track, was actually real. And it was real. Students who are on track in the 9th grade are 4 times more likely than their off-track peers to graduate from high school. Stakeholders in Chicago, in and around Chicago, embraced this concept of Freshmen on Track. And the Chicago Public Schools built a data system, an early warning data system with real-time data delivered to schools about how students were doing in the freshman year in terms of their attendance rate and grades. What happened is that the Freshmen on Track rate, which had been stagnant at around 50% for years, skyrocketed to 85% in 2014. In 2017, this number was 89% of freshmen who were on track to graduate. Perhaps most importantly, what we see is that the high school graduation rate has tracked alongside Freshmen on Track. And so we see that the predictive value of the indicator has actually held up in terms of students graduating, more students graduating from high school. This is literally thousands more students who have graduated because of the commitment of Chicago Public Schools to creating the right early warning system to track student progress in the 9th grade year. Let me put this line in perspective for you. Across this trend, Chicago Public Schools changed from a district in which students were as likely to drop out as they were to graduate, to a school district in which students were twice as likely to graduate from high school as they were to drop out. This is absolutely remarkable and an example of closing the knowledge gap. Freshmen on Track is a very important example of closing the knowledge gap, and it's no longer just a Chicago story. It's now the case that 11 states have adopted Freshmen on Track as a part of their Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, plan. So this is something that has spread throughout the nation. Now I want to talk about a second example of the knowledge gap, and this is about grades. There's a common belief in the education space, and there has been for a long time, in the power of standardized tests. I would argue that this started when the accountability era began in the United States in the mid-1990s, and it really came to the fore in 2001 when the No Child Left Behind Act was passed. Standardized tests have become the measure for everything, for student performance, for student college readiness, to measure teacher quality, principal quality, and school quality. And certainly while standardized tests are an important measure, the consortium has developed a very important truth about grades. And what it is this, that high school grade point average, or GPA, is actually the strongest predictor of what we care about, which is college graduation. This, like the discovery of the importance of the freshman year and Freshmen on Track, has been resisted. It's been embraced by Chicago Public Schools, but nationally, this has been a very hard reality for the field to grasp and to embrace. The field resists because grades have long been assumed to be subjective. The field resists because there are assumptions that standardized tests offer some truth about student knowledge or about teacher, principal, and school quality. And frankly, this is resisted because there's a lot of money to be made in standardized tests. So even among those students who have the same ACT score, what we see is that students that have higher high school GPAs are much more likely to graduate. So I'm showing you students who are all in the test score range of between 18 and 20 on the ACT. And what you see is that there's a lot of variability. Having a high school GPA makes you much more likely to finish college. Importantly, this relationship exists at all ranges of the ACT. Even at the highest levels of the ACT, there's variation in college graduation depending on your high school GPA. In fact, more than 2/3 of students who have a 3.0 or higher complete college, while more than half of students who have between a 2.5 and 2.9 complete college. And yet, despite the strong knowledge and the research evidence that we have, there's still resistance and disbelief in the field, as evidenced by this article that was just published a few weeks ago. We have to be relentless in closing knowledge gaps like this. The importance of the freshman year, the importance and predictive nature of grades. These are but two examples of closing the knowledge gap. So now I'm going to talk about the preparation gap, this gap between practitioners' passion for education and the preparation and support that they receive and need to be successful in urban schools. When I was in the field collecting data for my dissertation, one of the things that I did was interview and shadow teachers over a period of 2 years. One of those teachers was a woman that I will call Miss Fine. Miss Fine was a first-year teacher in the first year of my study. And so I was with her, working with her and interviewing her over 2 years. Across 2 school years, I watched Miss Fine unravel. From a spirited, confident, energetic idealist to an exhausted, frayed, uncertain person. She was prepared to write lesson plans and teach complex math content. She knew how to do integrated units. However, she struggled to communicate with parents, and she didn't know how to support a student who lost her brother to gun violence. We know that teachers matter. We know that they matter most for low-income students of color. We also know that low-income students are least likely to have a high-quality teacher. It's also true that 50% of teachers leave the profession in their first 5 years of teaching. And in high-needs contexts, that number is 80% of teachers leaving the profession in 3 years. So again and again, these teachers tell us that they're excited and passionate about working with students, disadvantaged students, but they don't have the skills to be successful. How do we close this preparation gap? One area in which Ms. Fine felt unprepared was in intersecting with parents and the surrounding community around the school. One of the things that we're doing, and this is new in our urban teacher education program, is actually placements for our teachers in the teacher training program in community-based organizations. There they work side by side with community leaders and activists, and they learn about the community. These are some of the organizations that we currently have our aspiring teachers doing placements: Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Blacks in Green, Blocks Together, the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign, and the Pilsen Alliance. This year, one of the projects that our aspiring teachers in UTEP will participate in is doing interviews with community leaders about issues that they're facing, and then conducting research on those issues and creating teaching tools that they will then give to the community-based organization. We see this as combining the skills that they need in curriculum and instruction with digging deep and learning and understanding to work in the communities in which they will serve as teachers. We see this as a really important part of closing the preparation gap. Another area in which Ms. Fine struggled was in supporting a student who lost her brother to gun violence. We know that 80% of students in inner city schools report that they have been exposed to at least one traumatic event. Many of them report that they've been exposed to multiple traumatic events. Brain science tells us this actually wires the brain differently and creates a fight or flight response in some of our students that makes it hard for them to learn and succeed in school. We have started to partner at UTEP with Dr. Masheri Keels, who is a professor in human development at the University of Chicago, to enroll all of our teachers, our alumni, and our aspiring teachers in trauma-informed practice. This includes human development coursework that teaches our aspiring teachers about brain science and about inequality. It also helps them to identify moments in which students are being responsive to stimuli that it is bringing back a traumatic experience, and also in giving them proactively tools in which they can manage classrooms and have disciplinary practices that are trauma-informed. Closing the preparation gap, community-based organization placements, trauma-informed practice. These are but two of the many ways in which we close the preparation gap. Now I'd like to move to the belief gap. I had the opportunity when I was a young and new leader to go on a site visit to a lot of turnaround high schools across the country. It was a field study group that visited a series of high schools across the country that had successfully turned around, so gone from being very low achieving schools to higher achieving schools. There was a principal in one of those schools that told an anecdote, which I think is a very chilling but also good example of the belief gap. This principal talked about how before turnaround, she and her colleagues organized classroom space, assuming a 40% dropout rate. So what they would do is they would plan junior and senior. It was an overcrowded school, but they knew that junior and senior year there would be 40% fewer students. And so they actually planned fewer seats and fewer classrooms in the junior and senior year. It wasn't until a young teacher raised this in a staff meeting and said that there were low expectations for students, and teachers pushed back, and she responded by pointing to the use of classroom space, that the principal and teachers in the school actually acknowledged that this was an example of low expectations in the school. She pointed to this as the beginning of the turnaround of the school, acknowledging that this belief gap exists. So this belief gap, this gap between pervasive stereotypes about what urban youth are capable of and what we know they can achieve, really demonstrates and shows itself in a lot of different ways. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about some work that's going on in the consortium that in many important ways aims at closing belief gaps. This non-cognitive work, under the leadership of Camille Farrington and done in close partnership with UChicago Impact, focuses on these non-cognitive skills. Non-cognitive skills are these soft skills, dispositions, study habits, things that sometimes people say are really important, but also, can they really be measured? And are there ways to actually develop them? There are also assumptions in the field that these non-cognitive skills are fixed, that you're either gritty or you're not, that some students just persevere while others don't. Camille's work has a lot of different dimensions to it, but I'm going to highlight just 3 insights that I think are relevant to the belief gap tonight. The first is, yes, you actually can measure non-cognitive skills. So what you see are these 5 non-cognitive factors. Academic behaviors, things like going to class and doing homework. Academic perseverance, so grit and tenacity. Academic mindsets, so a sense of belonging or a student's belief in his or her own ability. Learning strategies, things like study skills and goal setting. And social skills, like interpersonal skills and empathy. Not only are they measurable, but Camille's research has demonstrated the relationship between these factors. The second important insight that I want to highlight is that, in fact, they are not fixed. And what we know is that school and classroom contexts are actually very influential on students' ability to both develop these non-cognitive skills as well as to access them, which means that we can build environments in schools and classrooms and that we can actually promote and develop these non-cognitive skills in ways that can help them to succeed. Finally, the third insight that I would like to share is that there's a relationship between non-cognitive factors and outcomes that we care about. And this relationship goes between the development of non-cognitive factors, academic performance, and this link to long-term outcomes about things that we care about, like wealth, health, educational attainment, etc. These emergent understandings of non-cognitive factors close the belief gap on multiple important levels. It pushes on adult beliefs about the capability of students. It pushes on students' own beliefs about his or her ability to grow and succeed. And it pushes on schools to understand that the way that they organize classrooms does have an effect on students' ability to develop and access non-cognitive factors. Camille's work has been very influential throughout the country. These are just a few headlines that I've pulled, but that basically demonstrate the relationship between these non-cognitive factors and the belief gap. Students' self-perceptions factor into their achievement. If students believe they can get smarter, they do. And qualities needed for learning and how to nurture them. This combination of student belief gaps and adult belief gaps. Fostering non-cognitive factors is but one example of closing the belief gap. And yet there are so many belief gaps to close. This is very multifaceted, ranging from belief gaps about urban communities and the resources that are available within them, belief gaps about urban parents and the resources that they have to bring. These are but a few of the belief gaps that we must work to close. So we've talked about these 3 precursor gaps, the knowledge gap, the preparation gap, and the belief gap. In closing, I'm going to explore the intersection between the 3 of these. How do we bring them together to actually close the attainment gap and close the achievement gap, which is where we began the talk this evening? I'm going to highlight 2 projects. I'm not going to talk about them in detail, but I'm just going to draw connections between these precursor gaps and the work within these 2 projects. And I'm going to start with the attainment gap and the To and Through project. The To and Through project is a partnership between 2 units of the Urban Education Institute, the UChicago Consortium and UChicago Impact, and SSA's Network for College Success. The To and Through project is focusing on milestones that matter most with a combination of research, data, and professional learning. Importantly, it brings together a group of stakeholders around these 3 pillars, including family and communities, K-12 education, higher education, nonprofit partners, civic leaders, and policymakers. It is a collaborative model for change. I would make the argument, and we believe this, that the root of the attainment gap is in closing the knowledge, preparation, and belief gaps that I've just talked about. And in To and Through, this is done through research and data that close the knowledge gap. So research reports from the consortium, distillations of consortium research, as well as an online interactive tool that helps practitioners understand trends in high schools of students going to and through high school and to and through college. Professional learning that closes the preparation gap, so the Network for College Success working to take this research and make it actionable, helping school leadership teams to work on that in their schools. And finally, communications resources that close belief gaps, so Mythbusters and student videos and school profiles that highlight the success of students from all backgrounds going to and through high school and to and through Chicago. We believe that only by closing the knowledge, preparation, and belief gap can we close the attainment gap. Now let's talk briefly about the achievement gap. I'm going to talk about briefly the UChicago Charter Elementary School model. Last year, this book, The Ambitious Elementary School, was published by the University of Chicago Press. It was led by premier sociologist and University of Chicago professor Steve Raudenbush and his colleagues Lisa Rosen and Elizabeth McGee-Hastrick. Importantly, this book codifies the UChicago Charter model, the elementary school model. And it also comments on the effectiveness of this model at closing the achievement gap. The three elements of this model really focus on changing the model that Dan Lordy called an egg crate structure. Dan Lordy argued that the egg crate structure is typical of what you see in schools, in which teachers work in isolated egg crate structures. They're in their own room, they don't collaborate, they're isolated, and they're not thinking about students in a collective or collaborative way. In contrast, the UChicago Charter Elementary model is collaborative, rigorous, evidence-driven, and individualized. There are three elements that are described of the model in the book, and they're displayed here on the screen. These are aligned closely with closing the preparation, knowledge, and belief gaps. So the first element, which is about ambitious intellectual work for each child, is really about creating beliefs that students are capable of achieving at high levels, and closing knowledge and preparation gaps with school-wide approaches to teaching literacy and math and diagnostic assessments, et cetera. The second element of the model is about how teachers organize to ensure that every single child is immersed in ambitious intellectual work. This is connected to closing knowledge and preparation gaps with this ongoing support that teachers receive, hiring expert teachers, and collaboration. And finally, the third element is about mobilizing support, social and academic supports, and working with parents to make sure that students succeed. And here, we're talking about closing knowledge and belief gaps through this engagement and continual support. And the important part of this is that there's evidence that it does, in fact, close the achievement gap. The UChicago Charter Elementary Schools cut the black-white achievement gap by 76%. This is a remarkable achievement. And by the way, we have several members of our NKO and Donahue campuses in the audience, so kudos to all of you. Chicago is making headlines. The improvement is real, and the momentum is in the air. And yet, the work is never done. In front of us remains the same and new challenges, and some of them may feel insurmountable. I would maintain that our ability to continue to make progress require us to answer the fundamental questions that are at the heart of the gaps that I talked about tonight. Are we willing to seek and utilize the knowledge that changes schools, even if it means challenging assumptions about what matters that have been ingrained for decades? Will we have the courage to continue to invest in our teachers and leaders to prepare them in meaningful ways, even if it's countercultural or requires extensive resources? And perhaps most fundamentally, do we believe in the young people we serve? Are our expectations high enough? I challenge us all to continue our journey in closing these gaps from wherever we stand in whatever ways we can. Thank you so much.